these roundtables, is primarily to update the work we did 18 months ago. Now, there's a slight different take on it, on particularly question 2 on the information side of things. But then, and is somebody got their mic on? I'm getting a lot of chatter. Now I've forgotten where I've got to. Oh yeah. So we've got what we have had this over the last 6 meetings is half of the people on the call are actually new. So apologies to the old uns, but we're going to have a quick 10 minutes contextualization and historical piece from George, just to give everyone who's new some sort of idea of where we've been, where we're heading, and what we're hoping to do. George, do you want to take that away?
Okay. Yeah, so right, I'm initially just going to explain to people that aren't aware what we've been doing with BIM4Housing. So when we took over responsibility for it, sorry, it's not. Basically, when we took over responsibility for BIM4Housing about 3 years ago, what we were keen to do is move it away from thinking about BIM as being 3D modeling to transform it into better information management. And the way in which we've done that is by looking at the information that's needed for each of the different elements of owning buildings, either developing them, designing them, building them, manufacturing the parts that go into them, consultancy, and also operations. So each of those within BIM4Housing, we've got quite a strong stakeholder group that meets every 2 months. So, for example, I think we've got a construction group meeting and a design group meeting over the next couple of weeks, and those cycle every 8 weeks. And the purpose of them is to identify what information is needed by each of those different stakeholder groups to improve the flow of information. And the way in which we go about that is to create a work stream for particular topics. So one of the ones that is, if you like, enduring across them is data. So how can we make it so that data can flow through those processes? And the way we go about doing that is by trying to standardize data requirements and provide data templates. So those are the sorts of outputs that we've achieved. So the work streams probably only run for maybe a couple of months, and then ideally they produce an output that everybody can use. We've done the same with process, fire safety, and the purpose of these sessions over this week and last week is to actually look at the fire safety critical asset types that we published 18 months ago. We're doing a lot with carbon and also with digital records. So that's, if you like, what BIM4Housing is doing. And one of the challenges is looking at what information is needed for buildings, systems, assets. And if you ask people, they've all got a slightly different perspective as to whether they're involved in design and specification or delivery, or indeed maintenance and updating. So part of the exercise is to recognize that different people have got different information requirements and different levels of detail is needed. And also to be able to identify which of that information could be delivered in as documents and which of it is going to change and therefore needs to be kept up to date or is active. And part of this exercise is to really make sure that things like the fire risk assessment and safety case reports are recognised as being a snapshot in time. And therefore, if things change, the risk assessment needs to be rerun. And also it needs to tie back to individual records of assets, not creating even more golden threads. So just to give an example of that, it might be that, for example, you might have a a QR code or something on a door, and that needs to tie back to the individual door, but importantly, the data about the door. So the information requirements for that door in that context should be defined. You can then put that information into a product library so it becomes reusable, and also things like data sheets that go into O&Ms can then come from that. So what we're trying to do is glue things together and also provide the context. So if somebody's using an application like Plan Radar to go along and do fire door inspections, or Riskbase, or Hilti, or Civica CX, all of these applications, great applications, are gathering data. But what we want to do is make sure that they're all tying back to the same unique asset, because what we don't want is different records to be held in different databases that actually need humans to pull them together. So, and what we're trying to do is make the information machine readable. So just to put the context of that, the majority of the information is perfectly okay to be delivered as a PDF document. But things like fire rating, it's possible that we may be, it would be better if we could have that information in a machine readable format. So a human would need to read this or this data sheet or this data sheet because they're describing the fire resistant properties in different ways that a human can read and interpret, but computers can't. So that information we'd like to hold as active data or variable data. And to try and get on top of all this, about 2.5, 3 years ago, we started working with HACT, the Housing Association Charitable Trust, and lots of other experts to actually produce some standardized data templates that can be used for existing buildings and also new buildings. And if we do that, then it unlocks the data. And really, that's the purpose of BIM4Housing, to make data interoperable. So irrespective of which software applications you use, you've got the right data. And this is an example of the work that we've done. This was the work in progress. So you'll see here, we agreed a set of standard descriptions for asset types. This was a number of housing associations and councils came together to share their information on this. We've already mapped them against Uniclass and also against IFC, which is the BIM standard, and we've got a description against them. So all of this now we're managing in databases, but it also means that what you're also able to do is where, for example, you've got several different ways of describing an asset, those can all be held in the database. So you don't end up with multiple assets, albeit it's the same thing, but just being called something different. And we actually identified that 71 of the asset types that we compiled were fire related, and 152 covered safety more widely. Just to put some sort of substance behind the data, you might hear us talk about COBE data, which is the international standard for handover information. And the majority of people are just looking at what we call standard COBE data. So the point about these, this is a common way of any product or any material being described. So these are the standards. But what we then want to do is find out what information do we need to have about an AOV or a fire door or an emergency light or a damper. So that's attribute information, which is over and above the standard product data. And deciding which attributes we should be using, that's the purpose of really this subject matter expert group today, is to identify what information do we really need. And you might think that the BIM system would have it all, but it hasn't. Unless you ask for it, it won't be there. We've got libraries called IFCs to manage this. CIBSE have got their own information, and they contributed to BS 8644, which is the new FIRE standard. We've got the cost managers, NRM, and also distribution organizations. So the big merchants, they use something called ETIM. So all of these are relevant and appropriate, but it's a matter of finding out what's important for assets of this type. So here, this is an AOV, and a lot of this information, although this comes through from the BIM standards, probably isn't relevant to FM people or people that are doing inspections, but some of it might be. And so we want to try and filter that out and therefore deliver it in ways that can then be collected. So what this is doing, the exercise that we're doing today, is building on the work that we did under the Golden Thread Initiative, which was led by L&Q. We were responsible for the asset and survey information activities. And what we were trying to do was simplify things by identifying what information, asking experts like you, what information do we need? And invariably the answer was, it depends. It depends on where that emergency lighting is going, what the fire strategy is for the building, a whole range of different contextual questions. But the fundamental thing that everybody comes back to is there has to comply with building regs. But that in itself is a real catch-all because, or a challenge, because building regs themselves refer to 800 standards. And, you know, we've got people like Jim on the call here who actually writes those standards, but they in themselves require a lot of interpretation. So if we can actually simplify it by saying, okay, there's 250 asset types, what do we need to know about those asset types in certain contexts? So the exercise that we've gone through over the last 18 months, or before the last 18 months, we published these then, was for these key asset types. And that's the exercise that we're going through here to identify what information is needed about, let's say, a fire door. And we tried to put some sort of context behind it. This was the HSE's guidance to say, right, you've got a hazard, a fire breaks out in a kitchen. What are the measures that have been put in place to accommodate them or to mitigate them? It might be compartmentation. It might be smoke control. It might be detection. It also would be signage. And, you know, how do we achieve effective, safe escape routes? So it's a combination. The critical thing about this is that each individual asset is maybe, or an individual asset may be perfect, but it's got to really work in the context of a complete system. So that's what we're really trying to get to. So I'll just skip on. So this is the guidance that we're going to go through. And I just wanted to explain that the methodology that we're using is to, for each of the asset types, is to identify what the risk is that's being mitigated. What do people do to the emergency lighting to stop it from performing? What information do we need to know about it to ensure it performs? And that's the one I'm particularly interested in. But then also, what tasks, procedures should we be asking people to report to ensure that they're doing it properly? What levels of competency need to be in place? And also, how should product changes be recorded? So I'm going to hand over back to Richard now, because that's what we're going to be going through over the next hour or so.
Okay, just let me say right at the top, use the chat. We have the meeting's recorded. We do which you'll have access to. We do a high points document of all the most important points raised, which include what's in the chat. Sometimes I'll ask you to put something in the chat so we don't miss it, we don't lose it. I'm going to have a section at the end. I'm going to be really focused to move through this because there's a lot of work to be done. If something interesting comes up that's adjacent, I'm going to ask you to hold it, and we'll try and have 10 minutes at the end to cover those kind of things. I really don't want to digress too much. Okay, do you want to put the there we go. Right, just quickly on this first bit. What are the component elements of an emergency lighting system? Have a quick flick down there and see if there's anything that you think is missing or should be amended. Anything? I think that should be okay, actually. So scroll down just to the next one. Hello? Okay. Are there any dependencies on other systems? We've got backup electricity, for example, links to fire alarm systems, lighting control system. Anything else that would be a dependency?
The one bit that you might want to think about is if you use photoluminescent signage, there is a dependency because it depends upon the luminaire close to it for charging.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay. Could you, I don't know who that was actually.
That's not necessarily so. It doesn't mean close at all. Photoluminescence excites as low as 25 lux, which is way below the ambient light in any built environment for health and safety purposes. So that's not entirely true, and it's a myth.
Well, it's still dependent on a light source.
Well, the emergency lighting is dependent on electricity. Emergency lighting is dependent on there not being any smoke. So we can go round and round in circles, but you can't single photoluminescence out as a function of, because it's excited by daylight. So it's an anathema to actually separate it as needing something when it doesn't. All signing requires illumination. Most emergency lighting signs today are externally illuminated, not internally illuminated. So the same thing applies. So it's an anathema.
As soon as you externally illuminate a sign, it's got a dependency.
Yeah, well,
it's whether you want
every sign has a dependency on illumination.
It's whether you want to include that dependency or not. That's a different discussion. But there is a dependency.
Well, we're not putting it in for ordinary lights either, are we? For externally illuminated ones like blade signs that are not internally illuminated. So you know, we all of this stuff has to be maintained. So
okay, well, I'll tell you. Right, I don't want to get too hung up on one question. Peter, do you want to put a note to that effect in the chat, and we'll take that under advisement.
Okay,
I think that's the best way. Okay, what risks does an emergency lighting system mitigate? We'll flick through those. Trips, slips, and falls. Anything crying out for attention?
I would say it doesn't really mitigate anything because it's a reactive rather than proactive measure, and it aids evacuation by reducing panic by provision of anti-panic lighting and aids evacuation by provision of emergency escape lighting at sufficient level, but I can't really see it mitigates anything.
Well, if you can't see, you're going to fall over, aren't you? So it mitigates the risk of falling over, doesn't it, by definition?
It depends how you want to look at it. Yeah, can agree with this.
Good.
Okay. Anybody else got anything on that way? Okay. Question 1B. What risks are emergency lighting to what risks are emergency lighting systems susceptible? So what can happen to an emergency lighting system that stops it from working optimally?
Poor maintenance and incomplete or poor commissioning, and yeah, that comes to mind.
Yeah, I would say poor. Yeah, we've got maintenance on there, I think, Jarek. So I think definitely agree with the commissioning.
Whether you want incorrect operations, so it is possible to do hold-off circuits when a building is empty. If you don't effectively use them when you come back in, you can leave a building without any emergency lighting because you haven't put it back in operation.
Poor commissioning, Jess. Poor commissioning.
Peter, that sounded interesting. Would you mind putting that into the chat so that we can copy that through?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, scroll down. Anybody else got anything to add on to that one?
I've got one more. Coordination of the drain down tests. So if you have automatic lighting control systems or self-test luminaires, they would typically vary the time at the individual luminaires are being tested. But when you got like a standard systems, you basically turn off all the lighting for 3 hours, and if later during the next, say, 12 hours, you will have an emergency situation, the lights may not last the duration. So it's a coordination of the test procedure, maybe. I don't know how to label it, but hopefully
Could
you know
you
what I
put
mean.
that in the chat for me, Jarek?
Yeah.
And then we can copy over.
I think that whole thing about commissioning is so important, isn't it?
Is that all there is for 1B, Jess?
Is there anything below?
Yeah, that's all.
Right, okay. Well, what about poor substandard installation?
Well, I think we come on to that, don't we? This is particularly.
This is more about, I mean, even with the commissioning part, this is more about the things in situ. What can happen to it that will stop it working?
Exactly.
It's not really about commissioning.
Yeah, because we do. Yeah,
we come on to that. Just take commissioning out.
Yeah.
Because it's a different. The question's not clear, but I think we know what we mean. Okay, yeah. Unless anybody's got anything else to add on to that, let's go on to question 2.
Jarek, I still want you to write what you said in.
Yeah, write what you said, Jarek, please.
We'll just put it somewhere else.
Yeah,
I mean, it may be covered.
Once it's in that chat, we don't lose it. What information is needed about emergency lighting systems to ensure they perform as required? Now, George touched on this, our new look at this.
Yeah, can I?
In this intro. So, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just cover that, Richard, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just introducing you.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that we've done we did last time around, in particular when we were at Digital Construction Week, was to try and look at this from a point of view of it's all very well having all this information, but who actually produces it, who's responsible for it, who needs to be made aware of it, and what we've tried to do is use the sort of standard RACI methodology to actually identify that. So there's an exercise, we're not going to do that today, but there's an exercise that we want to do of saying, right, for emergency lighting, who, for example, is responsible for making sure that the fire safety strategy is there and is interpreted, who's responsible for, you know, recording the installation date or whatever. So what I'd like to ask is if people are interested in that, either from a data perspective. So everybody's got a different sort of take on things. Some people enjoy looking at the data side of things. Others will be looking at process, and another will be looking at how those processes and data are going to be applied. So what I'm asking for is a shout out now for you to perhaps just put into the chat whether this is something that you're willing to follow up with, maybe an hour and a half or so, another session to go through this exercise with us to say, right, who's going to be responsible for these areas? So fill out the RACI with that. So if you put your name into the chat just to say whether you're interested in data or process or whatever, that would be helpful. The other thing I'd like to highlight is this static or variable or passive or active data. So what I want to try and do is understand, for example, a technical specification sheet, that's probably going to be fixed to a particular product, and therefore that's static data, whereas the commissioning information will be variable. So if we can sort the wood out for the trees by identifying whether information is going to be static or variable, that would be also helpful. But that's it for now. As long as you put your name in the chat, we'll be
Okay,
happy.
let's go back to the document. There we go. Question 2. What information is needed about emergency lighting systems to ensure they perform as required? Well, we've got quite a long list there, so do you want to have a scroll down just so we can get as much on the page as we can? There we go.
Richard, while people are thinking about that, I'm not happy with the paragraph that's gone in regarding normal illumination on signs, because it's not specific enough under emergency
What
light.
paragraph? Where's that, Jim?
Well, it's just appeared before a new paragraph.
In the green writing.
Well, it's red to me, but it's not on this one. It's going back to the
Sorry.
lighting on signs. I mean, so it's back on question 1.
Could you? Okay.
Right, I'll tell you what. Just go back to question 2. Jim, could you put a note in the chat?
If I knew how to do that, I would. But as I say, I've been looking for the last 5 minutes to do.
Okay.
Right, Jim, look up underneath BIM4Housing Roundtables emergency lighting on the box that you're on.
Yeah, well,
Can you see a menu with some icons and things like that at the top where it says leave as well?
no,
Okay.
no, probably haven't got the right version. Probably.
Let me just show my screen for the minute. You might be able to.
Comments, you mean?
No.
Comments.
No. Can you now see my screen, Jim?
Yeah. Well, I think the whole paragraph is superfluous because we're talking
No,
about
no, no.
light-
Hang on. But we
Not
just don't want to
lighting.
talk about it at the moment. So, can you see my screen at the moment?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Can you see where my arrow is?
Yeah, and you got chat there.
That's it. Can you see that on yours?
Yeah, I can now.
Good. Okay.
Right.
That's where.
So if
That's
you
where the
pop it
chat
in
is.
there, Jim, that'd be great. Right, let's get back to the document.
Thank you, Jim.
Right. Well, that's disappeared now, but just anyway.
It disappeared on your screen.
Yeah.
Curious.
Right. Okay. Well, we know what you're talking about, Jim. We can come back to you later separately on that.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
That's no problem. Let's go through this and see if anybody's got anything they want to add in. It's quite a long list, so let's scroll down a little bit now. There we go.
Can you remind us what's the header of that part?
Yeah, it's the information needed. So, can you scroll back up, Jis? Yeah, it's the information that's needed to make sure that the product is going to perform as needed.
There's one more luminance level required.
Good.
Luminance level required.
And this in turn links to a higher strategy where the high risk areas should be identified, but they never are.
Agreed.
You've got to be careful. Signage has a luminance level, but the lighting of emergency escape routes in open areas is based on illuminance. So you might also want illuminance level required, because
Good.
actually that's what the standards have in.
Yeah, but illumination gives luminance. So
Yeah, but
we want to know what the luminance level is required at any given point, whether vertical or horizontal. That's the risk assessor's job.
But the standards don't contain that. So you'll get a number, and I've got no problem with that. But what do you compare it to?
Okay.
Okay. So, sorry, what did somebody say that the should be
Jared.
included that isn't? Was
Jared.
that you, Jared?
Yeah.
You said something should be included but never is. So
the standards have a specific illuminance required for high risk areas as per BS7 5266, I think. But those high risk areas are never specified. So then you as a designer, you don't know what to allow.
Yeah.
So
could you again? Could you put that into the chat for me?
Yeah,
I know it's a lot of typing.
No, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, so high risk areas need to be identified. Good.
You also have a new classification that's effectively stay put lighting. And that is a level of light that says if the electricity supply fails, but you don't need to evacuate the building, how much light do you need so you can stay safely? And that will be in the new standard.
So the information required would be how much light was needed.
Yeah.
Sir, can you repeat this, please? Whoever said that.
Yeah, effectively, you will have a classification that it's stay put lighting. So if the electricity supply fails, but it's not an evacuation situation, it might be safer to stay where you are. So therefore, the battery backup lighting has to give you an amount of light to keep you safe.
And that's defined, is it?
And that is defined in the new Well, the draft new EN 1838.
Great,
It-
so that's
It-
definitely
it's just
information
in
that we
BS
should be
5266,
requiring.
and it will
Could
be
you
fully
put a
defined.
note for me, please, of that in the chat so we can put it up?
Yep. Okay.
Fantastic, thank you. Can you just scroll down just so we can see the new stuff? Okay, anybody else, anything glaringly missing from what we've now got there? Paul Bray, you're being very quiet.
I've been writing away in the chat room, so maybe.
Oh,
No,
right.
that's-
This is excellent. Perfect.
That's
So,
Brilliant.
I'm listening.
That's even better, Paul.
So yeah, I've been
Absolutely.
listening. 'Cause if I said anything, you'd be saying, "Can you write it down?" So I've written it down already.
Well
But
done.
I was interested in the stay put lighting scenario because that does have an impact on housing providers. I was recently, well, when I first started with PCH in 2019, they were putting in a massive new emergency escape lighting system into a open balcony block of flats because it was to comply with the new British standard of revision of the British Standard 5266 2016, and that's where it's brought in the stay put emergency lighting for the not for fire but in case of primary lighting failure. So it's in there, and I was looking. I've got a handout note from the major changes that I was just looking at then. So
Excellent.
it's about the time scale. I can share this with you later, perhaps, but it's about the time scale that the lighting needs to stay there. But all very interesting, and but so I will comment in the chat room. I'm listening intently.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
No, that's excellent. Yeah, if anybody's got anything that is adjacent to this, it's not directly involved with this document. We've got an appendix for things, interesting pieces or papers or published works that support anything that's been said. So do let us have that so we can put it in the appendix. Okay, how are we doing? Anybody else got anything to add into this list now? Jess is still busy cutting and pasting. Have you got more to do, Jess?
No, that's all.
Okay. And anybody else? Okay, let's move down then.
I've got one more.
Sorry.
I don't know if that's for this section or not, but there is ambiguity in standards in relation to requirements for emergency lighting in the toilet cubicle.
Right. Yeah, okay. Where would that go? Yeah, it wouldn't be information required, would it? Would that be almost an addendum to question 1B, do you think? Because it's a risk, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not a risk that people are doing to the
No,
thing to
I
stop
know
it from
it's a funny
working.
one. Where would that go? Because that's quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that should be in 2. It would be part of the because there's a number. Are we on this
Well,
one?
no, Jarrett's talking about ambivalence. He's not saying there's not the information. That's the point. The information isn't that. So, what would be the information that should be defined, Jarrett?
Well, the standard needs to, in my opinion, needs to be a bit more or less ambiguous, because when you look at the standards, if the toilet cubicle is less than 8 square meters, well, the toilet facility is less than 8 square meters without borrowed light, then you need emergency lighting. But then if you have emergency lighting, let's say in the lobby outside the cubicle, and the cubicle has a full height door, you're basically sitting in a dark box without any lighting. And in those situations, people on various projects sometimes have emergency light, sometimes they haven't, and this is then down to building control to accept or not.
So
And
what would
this
be
is
the
a grey area.
information? What would be the information requirement then?
A clarification that addition to the standard in form of clarification that in a situation where the cubicle has no borrow light, it needs emergency lighting or not, just one of or the other, because it is ambiguous.
This seems to be very prescriptive to my. I mean, we might as well just say 5266, because there's no, there's no risk element in asking these questions, because it's saying this is what you do. 15 lux may be required. Well, where did that come from? Came from 5266, but it's not necessarily suitable and sufficient. And I thought we were actually trying to help people go through the process of risk assessment, not tell them the confines of a prescriptive regime.
No, absolutely. That's no. But if something has been prescribed in that document, then it's an information requirement as well, isn't it? Doesn't mean we can't add to it, but we can't just leave it out.
Here, as detailed in PREN 1838. So we need to look at that. What is the definition? Are we talking about the residential part of the building, or are we talking about the common areas? You can't put a paragraph out of context. And to me, it's just a whole bunch of very prescriptive paragraphs now. I'm not saying you can leave it in. I mean, that's fine, but I think it's more confusing than it is helpful.
Are we not identifying problems first to then be able to provide guidance? Is that's not what we're doing?
Well, but we can refer to people to guidance if the guidance is already there, and that's what they should be looking at. They shouldn't necessarily be looking at paragraphs out of context.
Well, Jim, one of the challenges is under building regs, as we said before, there are 800 standards that people are supposed to be interpreting, which is completely.
That's right. That's why I'm suggesting that we should bring some of the things up that need to be considered, because then they can go to because with search routines today, you can then read the whole part about that thing, but not where each one of these bullet points is almost a prescription.
Yeah, sadly, you can't do that anymore because of the way the British standards are being published. But that's another matter.
All right. Again, I'm sorry to say it, but as I say, what's a high risk area? If we don't define it, then we may be saying, well, 15 lux is required right the way through the building.
That is the problem with the standards. They don't define clearly the high risk areas.
For the risk assessor, but we've already done that by saying that the risk assessment does have to pay particular attention to the guidance applicable to an arrangement. You can't. Well, anyway, I mean, as I say, if it's what everybody wants, then I'll go along with it. But I'm not I'm happy.
I only mention this because although everyone's supposed to know about it, it is all out there. No one pay attention to it, and this is never done, and it's always ambiguous, and no one knows what the high risk areas are. For example, if we're talking about that particular item, no one knows what that is. It's never defined.
I would entirely support what Jarrett's saying there, because even that there are areas, the areas aren't properly defined, Jim, in BIM models, for example. So I think it is an important thing. I mean, at the end of the day, it's guidance. This is to prompt people to.
Sorry to interrupt, but the approved documents do give a kind of definition about what's high risk areas if you look into that. So it just depends where you're looking. But the approved document B, volume 1, which is for dwellings, which will include flats, talks about any high risk areas being heating. It says heating machinery, but it'll also talk about kitchens and places like that. So it's what you would class as not a normal area, not a corridor, but maybe a kitchen or a production room and things like that when we're talking about commercial. So I think they've got 3 definitions. I'll just searching through the document as we speak now. So what's the next one it talks about? Any high risk area, so heating machinery, particular hazards. So it's places of special fire risk. It will talk about within the approved document. So that's what I would go to as my starting point. What does it say? In the approved
totally
document?
agree with you. That's why we should be putting this in here. But bearing in mind the document that you're looking at, approved document B, is guidance as well. So it's not the legislation.
No, and that's absolutely agree with you.
Sufficient is the legislation. So yeah, I understand, but as I say, why not put approved document B as being the best guidance for this?
But again, I would say it's what a reasonable person would interpret as being high risk. So it's not what one person, but a reasonable person. Because if you work in a high risk industry, you may not class high risk as the same as what a person who doesn't work in a high risk industry. So it's what a reasonable person would class as high risk. Is a kitchen high risk? A commercial kitchen? Probably.
No, it's competent risk assessor. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, let's move on now. Your point is noted, Jim. Okay, let's go on to question 3. What tasks are required to ensure emergency lighting systems are installed, commissioned, inspected, and maintained properly? Right, let's look at installation first. Is that all of installation, Jess? Yeah, it is. Okay, let's look at installation first. There we go. Have a look at that. Right, Jess, can you put a carriage return before commissioned? Thank you. So we've got 2 points covering installation. Does that cover it? Anybody think it doesn't cover it?
A bit is a bit scarce, let's put it that way. Well, there's many kind of angles looking at this, but I don't know how, again, what we're trying to achieve. But for example, it needs to be installed as per design and checked whether it is installed as per design. I mean, in quantity and locations, for example, and the type of production, including exit signage, then type of the legend, whether it's correct, and so on. I think that adds value to this point. Another one quite good actually from installation point of view.
Oh wait, yeah, it's under commission, Gareth, Sharek. Actually, isn't it? It shouldn't be. It should be under installation.
Yeah, there's one more kind of practical installation problem. Quite often happen when you have corridor emergency escape lighting. It's directional very much, and sometimes those standalone 3 hours emergency lights are fitted with the wrong direction, basically, and significantly reducing the range. Does that make sense?
Yes, the angle's wrong. Right, okay. So that needs to be checked. Just delete commissioned. Yeah, it says here, doesn't it? To test and commission both photometrically and electrically as necessary. The system and providers fitted documentation in line with the actually installed installation and hand over the system to the client. Does that would cover your point, wouldn't it, Jarek?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going on about what I've raised at area question 2, because we talk about in the store bit when it says designer to design this emergency lighting system in accordance with the responsible person's risk assessment. I think we need to maybe put and/or a fire strategy for the building, because the responsible person's fire risk assessment or risk assessment wouldn't necessarily be being done in the building that's occupied. We need to. It's 2 schools of thought, at the design stage.
Yeah.
So it's not the risk assessment, it's the fire strategy.
After risk assessment, on the first para, after risk assessment, put and/or. What was it, Paul?
The fire strategy for the building, something like that.
The fire strategy for the building.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that's always missing when you design emergency lighting is no one tells you where any of the emergency equipment is. So you're supposed to highlight emergency call points, emergency equipment, firefighting equipment, and nobody ever tells you, and they do it at the last minute.
Yeah, a lot of the time. So I deal with plans for developments, and you look at it, and the architect and the designer have already identified where they think the fire alarm systems might go, call points, and emergency escape lighting, usually in accordance with what they believe to be the design principles of the British standards. And sometimes I get it wrong, but that's the outline interpretation of their drawing in the first place. So it's usually captured in the fire strategy, and then you'll never be able to completely specify where each unit goes, because you have to know the building better. And I think that's what, Jim will be aware of that. You're talking about what light levels are going to be, where the furniture is, etc. So it's just making sure it's in accordance with what's the fire strategy for the building for a new build or a complete redesign, perhaps.
Jim, you're on mute.
I've still got a problem in respect to, we talked, and I honestly do think that approved document B is the best source, but then we're making it very specific here that we refer to emergency lighting standards, yet we're only mentioning one. And obviously best practice documentation is very loose. I prefer guidance to be quite specific for the reasons other people have already said. You don't want to be too vague about these things. So
should we mention approved document B in there, Jim? Would that help?
Well, I think using appropriate guidance is fine, because then it means that there's got to be another search. Otherwise, you're going to have a great big list of acknowledgements and other documents to read.
I'm with you. Yeah.
And put in one. We've already mentioned PREN 1838. It doesn't even get a mention down here. So I do agree with the model completion certificate and the model certificate are very good sources of information, because if you look at those, you can see what types of tests you could. But as I say, I don't think that it should reference a specific standard, because risk assessors are supposed to be making variations to that standard for a start, because that's what doing a fire strategy is all about, in my opinion.
Right, so you think it's better to take out any identifiable standards?
But the onus on the competence. Put the onus on the competence to use appropriate standards and best practice documentations.
Well,
right, okay.
Could we say that such as?
Why do we need to do that? Because you've got plenty of acknowledgements for these things anyway, and anyone reading this can, effectively delve in even further.
How would they know where to get that information? Have we got that in here at all?
Well, I don't think we need it in here. The
Where-
actual no.
Where would they find it, Jim?
Well, we haven't defined that in signs, but earlier on in the other questions, so we're not going to define the standards throughout. As you say, there's 800 of them they can choose from. The risk assessor should, if he's going to design a system, and it says with the responsible person's risk assessment, and or is a bit vague for me because it's and the fire safety strategy, because they have to have a fire safety strategy.
Yeah, okay.
And using appropriate standards and guidance as a baseline to ensure safe escape from the building. It's down to them. It all falls around what the risk assessment says. That's the basis of arrangements in the building, the risk assessment. That's the legal requirement.
Jim, it just like to interrupt. I'm a risk assessor as well as a consultant, but I would never define or design an emergency escape lighting system for a building. I would be saying the emergency escape lighting system or an emergency escape lighting system needs to be installed in accordance with BS 5266 standard. That's what I would be quoting.
So you actually prescribe an emergency light over every first aid box then?
I would do it in accordance with that, and then you're allowed variations. So it would be in accordance with that. And
that's what I just said, and I agree with you. If that's the basis,
but you're allowed variations in the all British standards allow you to have variations as long as you justify it.
Yeah, and you should set them as a risk assessor.
I may have a conversation with somebody about whether or not that would be required over every first aid box, but I'm not a designer of fire alarms of emergency light systems. I'm not that specialist. So that's where the risk assessor or even the architect and the person who writes the fire strategy for the building would be reliant on somebody who's competent in that design. So you're relying on a competent person doing the design. So my point.
We're in total agreement.
Yeah, but my point that I'm trying to say earlier is that it's if we're at the risk assessment stage of deciding that the emergency light system needs to be installed, something's been missed along the line, because it should either already be there, or it may be that there's been a change in the standards, or you're doing a refurb of the building, so you're reviewing it. You wouldn't ordinarily retrospectively be installing emergency lighting in a building unless it has been identified from a health and safety reason or a fire risk assessment process. But you rarely retrospectively install systems to meet current standards. It's not a given thing. So we're
agreed. But that's what I'm saying. It's why it should be open. It says using appropriate standards and best practice documentation or guidance documentation, because it allows all of those variations.
Well, it says that, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. It says BS 5266 Part 1 emergency lighting Part 1 Code of Practice for emergency lighting.
That at the bottom, right? Yeah. Okay.
Right. As I say, it's
Jim, if you let me get a word in, I'll get Jis to make some amendments.
Okay.
So sorry, Richard. Just one more point, if I may. What I would normally have put in, because in the old days when we were in Europe, you'd be able to apply European and even American standards. So the appropriate phrase we used to use, or equivalent. So you're looking for equivalence across the board. So if you quote BS 5266, then you said or equivalent standard. So you could use American standards or European standards, providing it met the requirements of making the building safe for its use or occupation.
Right. Just let me. Right. Jis, where it says and or, take out or and the slash. Right. So that's now general and non-committal, and yeah.
And use
make it say using on that same line, using the appropriate.
Can you just take out the, because that the means a singular one, so
it doesn't actually in this case, no. Carry on down, Jess. Right, so we're saying we want to delete from BS5266 that whole section.
Well,
Or
I
are we saying we want to add or equivalent?
think
the
or equivalent.
The
Yeah, I
reason
think
they
so.
were put in is because they aren't copyright, and those parts of the standard are free to copy.
Excellent.
Ah,
Okay.
okay.
So that was
Right.
the only reason the annexes were put in, because they're there for you to copy and use as you wish.
Right, okay,
It's
okay.
also-
Right, so just put there or equivalent.
Yeah, and it's also probably worth noting that we've had Brexit, but in the standards world, we're still part of Europe. So BSI negotiated a special membership with CEN to stay within the European standard system. So we still follow European standards.
Okay, let's press on.
Just put the colon after or equivalent. Great. Now scroll down, please. Right, inspected and maintained. The maintainer to be responsible for the ongoing inspection. Right, where it says it includes the following, Jess, on line 3, put includes the following or equivalent.
Yeah.
Before the colon, yeah. There we go.
And then also change where it says extract, where your cursor is at the moment, where it says extract, as an example.
Right, yeah. Take extract out and put as an example.
Yeah.
Also, do a carriage return at the beginning of that sentence before the.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Right, scroll down. That's an example from SFG 20. Right, question 4. We're getting on to competency and training. What competency and training needs to be in place? Right, scroll down so we can see as much of the black writing as we can. There we go.
Are people aware of any other competency or assessment frameworks or methods for emergency lighting?
I think the FIA do training courses. I know they do fire alarms.
Can we put that in green and ask for it to be checked, please?
Yeah, just put a note in there, just in green, FIA, check FIA.
That's helpful, Jim. Thank you.
Put it in italics and green. Somebody had their hand up and they disappeared. Peter, was that you?
Do manufacturers do training as well? Yeah, the FIA does do training. Just looked on their website.
Oh, right, okay. Well, we'll put something in relevant. Okay, what have we got underneath that? For maintenance.
What about things like frequency? Has that been changed at all with the legislation? Is it how frequently are you supposed to test it or maintain it?
Well, effectively, your test levels go daily, monthly, yearly, and there will be a 5-yearly test as well.
Yeah.
So you test different things. So every day you're supposed to check that the green LED charge indicator is lit, for example.
Yep. And
Yeah,
what about
this-
maintenance? What about maintenance, Peter?
Maintenance depends. You're supposed to have your battery life, and that's the only bit that you're supposed to directly maintain based on manufacturer's recommendations. And after that, it depends on what your testing does. If you find there is some damage or you find it fails the lifetime test or whatever, then you have to maintain it.
So there's no, other than testing, there's no actual regular maintenance.
No, you have to go around and inspect it, and I want to say once a month, but that may not be right. Actually, just look at it, because even if you have automatic test systems, it doesn't necessarily tell you that somebody's put the boot through it.
Yeah.
Okay, so nobody's got anything to add to training and competence.
Now, competence is the next one, isn't it? That's a good point that Richard's just made, the cleaning, because that is an activity, isn't it?
Yeah, that can be done at the same time as the annual.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else for maintenance? Right, scroll down, Jess.
Sorry, you got a bit about training, referring to standards. What about referring to specific operation of the system installed and lighting control? Or if you have automatic emergency lighting testing facility, you do need to train your maintenance team in that specific project-specific system, not just how to read drawings.
Yeah, that training shouldn't actually be there. That should be in the next section.
Okay.
Sorry. That should be in question 4, Jess.
Yeah, because it's competence, isn't it? In fact,
that's
the
not-
other one as well, that reference to BS.
Yeah, that below the fold, BSI Flex.
Yeah.
That needs to go into training as well. Okay, so let's scroll down past maintenance. Right, wait a minute, go back up.
Ah, we were on competence.
We were on question 4. I thought we were on
Yeah.
question 4.
Okay, that was a that was me. Sorry.
Yeah, so put those back in.
Yeah, it's
No, I
done
don't
that.
think it was you, actually. I think it's Jess, because I think he skipped question 3.
No, we did see it.
Yeah, we did see it. You did see it.
Yeah, we
It's
did
just
see it.
complete.
Oh, that was this one. Yeah,
Yeah.
we have done questions. Sorry, that was a quick one. Okay, so that's all back in there now.
Yeah.
Right, so change management. How are the changes from one product to another recorded? Or how should they be recorded?
So part of the purpose of this is to accommodate the new sort of drive to deal with the gateways on new build, but also where we've got, for example, there's a lot of lighting replacement, isn't there, for all sorts of reasons. I don't know whether is LED relevant to emergency lighting? The sort of change out of lighting for LED, is that relevant to emergency lighting also? Peter, would
Yes.
you know that?
It's relevant in that you probably can't buy a non-LED emergency light now. It's not particularly relevant for energy saving because, let's be honest, they're not on that much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
LED is pretty much standard now. I think we had one of those conversations about change management, and there was some samples people sent of what's good look like in regards to change management. If we could maybe somehow get this information and puzzle it all together. But just to comment on this, what you have, you've got two aspects of change, which may be driven from aesthetic and technical requirements. And they are then the decision is being made by different group of people. Don't know if that's somehow need to be captured or not.
No, I think it should.
Absolutely. Scroll down just so we can see what we've got down here.
Now this isn't specific to emergency lighting. It's
No.
more trying to accommodate the sort of general change management process. But what would be helpful is if anybody's got any view that is particularly relevant to emergency lighting. And I think, what Jarrett was saying there, I think is a really good point. Can you remember which of the workshops that was done in, Jarrett?
I searched through my emails because I think I've seen some emails regarding, I've seen some samples of change management that may be actually quite
Oh,
good
people have
for this.
emailed stuff through, have they?
If we can try and find that as an example, that'd be excellent.
I've not seen anything sent through on change management.
I find it. Maybe this was completely different
If
group,
you
but
can,
I think,
yeah, I've not seen it.
I don't know what you think, but as a guidance, it's almost you need a kind of process map of kind of cause and effect again.
Yes.
What's happening and what can happen if you won't do this and that, and
Yeah,
because the change in regards to emergency lighting, change will be driven from experience. Now I'm talking, say, aesthetic points of view, and then cost. They kind of combined, and then you've got technical checks being made whether what's proposed from aesthetic point of view actually complies with requirements, gives you enough light and duration. And then if this fails, then you go back and it goes round the circle kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just enough light. It's I've seen cases where people have decided for aesthetic reasons they will use a smaller sign. But then that changes your viewing distance, so you should have more signs, but they don't do that. They just do a smaller sign.
Yes.
So it would be good to produce some kind of process map of what needs to happen and what check needs to be done, and include all those steps.
Is there anybody on this call that's interested in that change management side of things? Because if you are, if you could just put your name in the chat and put against it process, then we can pick that up.
Let's hear from some of the people we've not heard from. David Lindsley. Are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Hi, David. What do you think? Anything you want to add to this?
No, the discussion for me, for my role, is a little bit highbrow. All I need to know is my role as a fire risk assessor. Is it in place? Is it suitable? Does it illuminate the means of escape? And then is it tested in daily, monthly, and annually? And then
Right. Okay.
5-yearly.
That's very helpful, actually. Yeah. So basically, you're looking to make sure that other people have done their work properly.
I need to know that it does what it says on the tin. That's it. It's as simple as that for me. In the simple buildings that I assess.
And are we in this? Are we collecting the information that you need to do that? I mean, we're probably collecting hugely more information that you need.
You are.
But
Yeah.
Are we collecting enough?
Well, the discussion's interesting because there must be a huge range of buildings that you're drawing your examples from. But for the buildings that are assessed, I just need to know that it's there, it's suitable, it's sufficient, and it will work, because it's tested, that it's fitted to the standard 52266. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. It does.
I asked a question in the chat bar because I didn't understand it, and it was what does building churn and redesign mean in terms of how people will not use it because they didn't understand it. Emergent lighting for me is that when it's called upon, they will use it because that's how they will find their way out of the building. And I didn't understand the question, the statement.
Does anybody else want to respond to that? I can try. I mean, remember that all of these, David, have been written by people like you and volunteers. So there's no, if you like, a single author that. Right. And I've certainly not written it.
Right, well, I just didn't understand it. That's why I asked the question.
I think the point about churn is possibly that the building may have been designed in a certain way to operate in a certain way, and then the tendencies changed, or maybe some of the organization of the way the building is used has changed, but the emergency lighting still reflects what the original strategy was.
And the original use, right? Get it. Okay, right, that makes sense now.
Yeah, if I may, on that one, George, just also to add up, I found that word churn quite a strange word to use for that, because you usually use that for turnover of staff, not changing buildings. So
we could change the word.
Yeah, because if a building changes, maybe because you'll get an open plan office that'll become cellular or vice versa, and then perhaps I'm getting loads of feedback.
David, could you put your mic on mute? Thank you. Cheers.
And then perhaps it comes from being like lots of offices to be an open plan. So the layout of the emergency lighting scheme wouldn't really reflect the way that people would evacuate from the building. I think this is really important because this is what happens in a lot of buildings, that the building changes, not just for emergency lighting, but for everything. And that's what happened at Grenfell Tower. You make changes to the original layout or structure of the building, and it has that consequence to the way the building would operate in a fire situation or any other emergency. So, yeah.
Okay, anybody else got anything to add in? Jean-Marc.
No, nothing for me.
Nothing?
Okay.
Cheers. Martin Baines?
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're all ducking out, aren't you?
Well, we've only got 5 minutes to go. So
I know we have, George. I'm fully aware of that. Okay, so anybody else need to add anything, or feel they need to add anything to that last section?
I'd just like to ask anybody that hasn't put their name in the chat to see if you are willing to spare an hour or so going forward, then please do so. And Jean-Marc, could we have a catch up when we finish? Is that possible? Just picking up on what we were talking about yesterday.
What sort of time are we looking at?
To suit you.
Yeah. So what sort of time are we talking about? Just now after this?
Yeah.
Meeting, or?
Yeah.
About 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, good. Excellent.
Okay, well, I think we're done then, aren't we? Anything you want to add, George?
No, I don't think so. I think I'd just like to thank everybody that's been on the call. And, we're all volunteers. So obviously we want to try and make sure that the efforts that we're all putting in are crystallized. But, we're actually doing this as volunteers as well. So we're limited in our time, but I hope you found it useful. And if you have, then please encourage others to join the sessions that we've got coming up.
Okay, with that, I'll say also thank you very much, and hopefully see some of you on the next 5 in the next 5 roundtables.
Jean-Marc, do you want to just stay on the call?
Cheers.
And then we can pick up from there.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
He's just walked past me, so I don't think he's on the call
See ya.
still.
Okay.
Martin,
Cheers.
do you